The South Carolina legislative session has ended, and here to give us a recap of what went down at the state capitol is Krystel Reid Heath, Chief Strategist and CEO of Capital Consulting Strategies. Great to have you back.
Thank you for having me.
It's always good to know what's happening up at the state capitol. We hear some of the headline-making bills that made it, didn't make it, they're getting pushed down the road. But perhaps we can sort of go over, we were joking before we got started, the Schoolhouse Rock version, the Cliff's Notes version of how introduction of bills works, the process that it goes through until it actually either gets made into law or vetoed.
Sure, so if it's a fiscal bill, all fiscal bills originate in the House, and usually it's assigned to a committee that has to deal with that, so specifically the House Ways and Means Committee. If it's not a fiscal bill, typically every year in December, the first or 2 weeks of December, you have pre-filed legislation which gets assigned to a committee. From a committee, sometimes the bill gets a markup in a hearing. Most bills actually never make it out of committee, but if it does, it goes to subcommittee, then there's a favorable vote, it goes back to the full committee, then it goes to the floor of that respective body for it to pass. If it passes out of that chamber, then it goes over to the other chamber, and that process starts all over again. If both chambers pass it, then it goes to the governor for his or her signature.
Or he could veto it.
You
So
could.
all that work could be for nothing.
Then it starts over.
And then it starts all over again. So really, it's quite a rigorous process.
It is, and when you think about the number of bills that are introduced, less than 5% pass. So it's a very small number.
It's incredible that any bills get made into law in the first place because of just the lengthy process that it takes. And when you say 5%, so about how many bills would you say were introduced in this last legislative session?
A little over 700.
Oh gosh.
And so 45 bills passed, so it's far beyond that threshold.
Wow, okay, and we're going to get into that. We're going to talk about some of the headline-making bills, the ones that sort of affect most of us, either here in the Low Country or the state as a whole. But the session began in January, it just ended recently, and then we're looking at possibly coming back before the end of June, and then it starts all over again next January, right?
Right, so they adjourn to what's called sine die, which means that you have 2 sessions in a legislative year. So this was the first session. Next year finishes the second session. So bills that weren't passed or didn't finish have an opportunity to finish the next year. If it doesn't, then you lose all that legislative history and you start over. When they come back, it's a very small committee. It's the conference committee. So the House appointed some members, the Senate appointed some members. Because the budget wasn't finalized, those conference committee members are going to hash out the differences and then present it to the governor. But the legislative session can also be recalled by Speaker Morrell, but he said they're not going to call them back unless something significant happens.
I see, okay. Let's talk about the budget. That is something that I think we can all relate to. So as far as the state budget is concerned, what talks are being made right now? What are we looking at for the 25-26 session?
So huge budget, $14 billion budget. Wow. Interestingly enough, the budget of Economic Board Advisors is coming back May 20th to review additional budget projections. So if there's additional revenue, then there's an opportunity for additional allocations to the budget. But when you look at key themes, education was huge. So though the House and the Senate have different versions, they both prioritize education. Teacher pay went up to $48,500, which was slightly short of the $50,000 that Governor McMaster requested. Also, there's talks about tax reform. So the House introduced a bill, H 4216, passed the House, but it didn't go to the Senate. And with that bill, the goal was to ultimately reduce the overall tax rate to 1.99%. As it stands, it's 1.99% of the first $30,000 of income. Everything above that would be taxed at 5.39%. But because that didn't pass, we'll have to wait to see what happens there. But suffice it to say, most of the legislative session was around tax reform. That didn't get done. Governor McMaster has said that he favors reducing or actually eliminating the income tax altogether.
I know, exactly. And of course, everybody's waiting with bated breath to see that happen. So are we thinking that, does it look good as we come back into session? Do you think that this is actually going to be a possibility to completely eliminate the income tax here in South Carolina?
Maybe not eliminate, but when you look at the composition of our legislature, and we talked about this at our last session together, it is significantly more conservative. And the House Ways and Means Chairman has said that that's an important priority. The governor has said it's a priority. It's already passed one particular legislative chamber, the House. So it's very likely, at a minimum, that it will be introduced and taken up in the Senate. I expect to see some legislative activity again. I expect to see in next year Governor McMaster's budget for him to talk about it again. It will be introduced. The question is not if, it's when and how much.
So who are the ones that are saying, not so fast?
Well, I don't want to call anyone out,
Sure.
but suffice it to say, the opponents of tax reform legislation. So when you think about a budget is a pie. And so think about a certain percentage of it. So if you say, well, if we cut from here, how do we offset the revenue that we're giving the tax reduction to? And so opponents of the legislation or the tax reform says, okay, great, tax reform, but how are we going to pay for it? So that's the question.
I see. Okay. And we also haven't even touched on healthcare. And we did talk about education, but there's so many more things that we do need to talk about. We'll do that after the break. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back. Welcome back. We've been chatting with Krystel Reid Heath, Chief Strategist and CEO of Capital Consulting Strategies. We've been talking about the end of the legislative session here in South Carolina. We are talking about budgets, and we want to talk about health care.
Sure.
So that's something very important to people here, especially those that are in rural communities that need access. But also, just as far as the budget is concerned, we don't have enough, I think, healthcare providers to go around in this state. So what is on the docket there?
Sure. So the Department of Health and Human Services is by far the largest entity that regulates public health in the state. And so with that, there's funding in the budget for both the Senate and the House, although the versions are very different as to how they fund state employees that take care of our public workers. But specifically, the Senate version actually pays for the additional health care premiums. So there's not going to be an increase of health care premiums for people that are employees of DHHS. Whereas the House version of it says, okay, healthcare premiums are important, but that's offset by the cost of the employees. So the employees would have to cover that difference as well. There's a 2% pay increase for the employees of the Department of Social Services. The Senate also prioritized funding additional employees, 170 employees to DSS. The House prioritized it as well, but not as much.
Okay, yeah, I was wondering about that, if we were going to see any addition to the workforce, because it's sorely needed. As the state expands, we need more people.
It is, and actually recently Director Tony Catone was confirmed as the next director of DSS, and I attended his confirmation hearing, and at his confirmation hearing he said just that he wanted to prioritize the longevity of employees that take care of others in the state, actually through child welfare and through child services.
Absolutely. Okay, very good. And then we were also discussing about the neurological hospital. So tell us more about this. This is with USC.
It is.
Yeah.
And so $150 million was funded from the Capital Reserve Fund to expand access to neurological services, to look at things like Alzheimer's, to figure out maybe some preventative services. So that was overwhelmingly funded. When they go back to review the budget, they won't have to figure out if it's funded or not. It was 100% funded.
Wonderful. Okay, very good. Let's jump to infrastructure.
Sure.
This is something that we all can relate to, of course. We need better. We need better in the state. So are we going to see some more dollars being put towards repairing our bridges, repairing our roads, expanding our roads?
So there was a priority in the budget for both infrastructure, bridges, roads. The House prioritized it more than the Senate. They'll have to work out the differences. I think whatever the final budget will be, we will see additional funding, not just for roads and bridges, but also for disaster recovery. That was funded by the Capital Reserve Fund. So for people that were victims of Hurricane Helene, actually they'll have an opportunity to receive some additional funding to help with those repairs and recovering back into their homes if they didn't receive federal assistance. So there's money there.
Okay, very good. And I would be remiss, and we talked about this during the break, is the 526 extension project, which is now killed. So a lot of people were for it, a lot of people were against it, many people were against it because of the traffic it would create on James Island and that general area. But maybe you could also dispel sort of what the difference is. So when we talk about, yes, there's money for infrastructure, people are going to ask, well, couldn't that money be spent on a 526 extension?
Sure.
Completely separate things.
So our infrastructure is funded from four pots of money, if you will: federal dollars, state dollars, local dollars, and special grants that municipalities or counties can apply for. So the local option sales tax that failed, that would have been one conduit or way to pass it. So potentially, if county council is able to get that passed and introduced, then that's a funding source. If in the state budget there's funding that's federal dollars are received or state dollars are allocated, then municipalities like Charleston County could apply for a project to be funded for that. But it's too early to see because we've not finished the budget, and the House and the Senate have very different versions. They prioritize infrastructure funding, but it's not clear how that benefits municipalities or counties at the moment.
Okay, very good. And just with a little bit of time left here, I want to talk about energy.
Sure.
Energy costs are going up, and people who are Santee Cooper customer or anybody else, they are seeing their rates rise.
Sure.
So we're hearing of a joint venture that's between a private and a public entity. Tell us a little bit more about this.
Sure. So if that joint venture does just what you described, it gives them permission to work together. There's very strong feelings for both the opponents and the proponents. The proponents of this say, well, it's a natural option to actually reduce bills. Opponents of this say, think of VC summer. Think of what happened. We had public dollars that funded this initiative. It was not successful, and they're still trying to find a buyer for that. But potentially, if this does work, it will potentially reduce the cost of energy overall. But a lot of people are concerned about the lack of regulations and the oversight. Specifically, Senator Massey, Senate Majority Leader, said that this was a concern. He was concerned about the regulation and the lack of freedom or control over that. So we'll see. It has the potential to be good, but it just depends how it's implemented.
Well, hopefully the second stab at something here is going to be an improvement upon the last.
We'll see.
We'll see. We shall see indeed. Krystel Reid Heath, thank you so much for joining us and boiling everything down for us lay people to better understand what's going on.
Thank you for having me.
Appreciate it. We'll be back after this.